the giants lingered longer in the far north than elsewhere. About 200 years after the death of Charlemagne, there was living in Iceland a saga hero named Grettir the Strong. He was the most powerful man ever known in the North Country. More than once he had overcome dreaded berserks in their battle fury. On a narrow path on a cliff face he conquered a huge bear with his naked hands, holding off the infuriated beast by the ears till he could topple it over the precipice. But his strength and high spirit brought him great reverses and caused him to be an outlaw for much of his troubled life. During his wanderings through the wild unknown regions as a forest man, he spent one winter under the Geitland Glacier where the hot springs made a fair grassy valley, and here he was intimate with a giant named Thorir, whose daughters were glad to see him because not many people came there. Finding it dull, he resumed his travels and came into Bardadal. Here dwelt a widow with young children. The place had an evil name from a strange happening. 2 winters before, Steinver had gone as usual to celebrate Yule at the neighboring town of Ijardalsa, while her husband, Thorstein the White, stayed at home. Men lay down to sleep in the evening, and in the night they heard a great noise in the room near the farmer's bed. No one dared to get up to see what was the matter, because there were so few of them. The mistress of the house returned home the next morning, but her husband had disappeared and no one knew what had become of him. So the next season passed. The following winter the mistress wanted to go to Mass, and told her servant to stay at home. He was very unwilling but said she should be obeyed. It happened just as before. This time the servant disappeared. People thought it very strange, and found some drops of blood upon the outer door, so they supposed that some evil spirit, or troll, must have carried off both the men. This story had spread all through the district. It came to the ears of Grettir, who being well accustomed to dealing with ghosts and spectres turned his steps thither and arrived on Yule Eve at Sandhagar. He was disguised, as was now his custom, because his enemy Thorir had set a price on his head, and called himself Jest. The lady of the house saw that he was enormously tall, and the servants were terribly afraid of him. He asked for hospitality. The mistress told him that food was ready for him but that he must see after himself. He said he would, and added, "I will stay in the house while you go to Mass if you would like it." She said, "You must be a brave man to venture to stay in this house." "I do not care for a dull life," he said. Then she said, "I do not want to remain at home, but I cannot get across the river." "I will come with you," said the pretended Jest. So she made ready to go to Mass with her little daughter. It was thawing outside, the river was flooded and was covered with ice. "It is impossible for man or horse to cross," said Steinver. "There must be fords," said Jest. "Do not be afraid. First carry the maiden over, she is lighter." "I don't want to make 2 journeys of it," said he, "I will carry you in my arms." She crossed herself and said, "That is impossible, what will you do with the girl?" "I will find a way," said Jest. Taking them both up, he set the girl on her mother's knee, while he bore them both on his left arm, keeping his right arm free. So he carried them across. They were too frightened to cry out. The river came up to his breast, and a great piece of ice came against him, which he pushed off with the hand that was free. Then the stream became so deep that it broke over his shoulder, but he waded on vigorously till he reached the other bank and put them on shore. The mistress reached Ijardalsa for Mass, and everyone wondered how she had crossed the river. She said she did not know whether it was a man or a troll who had carried her over. The priest said it was certainly a man, though unlike other men. "Let us keep silent over it, it could be that he means to help you in your difficulties." She stayed there that night. Meanwhile, Grettir had waded back. It was nearly dark by the time he got home to Sandhagar and called for some food. When he had eaten something he told the servants to go to the other end of the hall. Then he got some boards and loose logs and laid them across the hall to make a great barricade so that none of the servants could get across. No one dared to oppose him or to object to anything. The entrance was in the side wall of the hall under the back gable, and near it was a crossbench upon which Grettir laid himself, keeping on his clothes, with a light burning in the room. So he lay till into the night. Towards midnight he heard a loud noise outside, and very soon there walked a huge trollwife into the room. She carried a trough in one hand and a rather large cutlass in the other. She looked around the room as she entered, and on seeing Grettir lying there she rushed at him. He started up and attacked her furiously. They fought long together. She was the stronger, but he evaded her skillfully. Everything near them and the paneling of the back wall were broken to pieces. She dragged him through the hall door out to the porch, where he resisted vigorously. The trollwife wanted to drag him out of the house, but before that was done they had broken up all the fittings of the outer door and borne them away on their shoulders. Then she strove to get to the river and among the rocks. Gregor was terribly fatigued, but there was no choice but either to brace himself or be dragged down to the rocks. All night long they struggled together, and he thought he had never met with such a monster for strength. She gripped him so tightly to herself that he could do nothing with either hand but cling to her waist. When at last they reached a rock by the river, he swung the monster around and got his right hand loose. Then he quickly seized the short sword he was wearing, drew it, and struck at the troll's right shoulder, cutting off her right arm and releasing himself. She sprang among the rocks and disappeared in the waterfall. Gregor, very stiff and tired, lay long by the rock. At daylight he went back to the hall and lay down on his bed, blue and swollen all over. When Steinver came home she found the place all in disorder. She went to the stranger and asked him what had happened and why everything was broken to pieces. He told her the whole adventure, just as it had happened. She thought it a matter of great moment and asked him who he was. He told her the truth, said that he wished to see a priest, and asked her to send for one. She did so. Stein the priest came to Sandhagar and soon learnt that it was Gregor, the son of Asmund, who had come there under the name of Jest. The priest asked him what he thought had become of Steinver's husband and servant who had disappeared. Gregor said they must have been taken among the rocks. The priest said he could not believe that, unless he gave some evidence of it. Gregor declared that later it would become known, and the priest went home. Gregor lay many days in his bed, and the lady did all she could for him. He himself always declared that the troll-woman sprang among the rocks in the waterfall when she was wounded, but the men of Bardadal have a tale that the sun rose and day dawned while they were wrestling, so that when he cut off her arm she lost her powers and is still standing there on the mountain in the likeness of a hideous woman. However that may be, the dwellers in the valley kept Gregor's secret so that he was safe from his enemies and the blood feud while he lay helpless. One day that winter, after Yule, Gregor went to Iderdalsa and met Stein, to whom he said, "I see, priest, that you have little belief in what I say. Now I wish you to come with me to the river and see for yourself what probability there is in it." The priest did so. When they reached the falls they saw a cave, up under the rocks. The cliff was so steep that no one could climb it, and it was nearly 10 fathoms down to the water. They had a rope with them. "It is quite impossible for anyone to get down there," said the priest. Gregor answered, "It is certainly possible, and men of high mettle are those who would feel themselves happiest there. I want to see what there is back of the fall. You mind the rope?" The priest said he would. He drove a stake into the ground and laid stones against it. Gregor now fastened a stone in a loop at the end of the rope and lowered it into the water. "How do you mean to go?" asked Stein. "I don't mean to be bound when I come into the fall," Gregor said. Then he prepared to go. He had few clothes on, and only a short sword, no other arms. He jumped from a rock and got down to the fall. The priest saw the soles of his feet, but after that, did not know what had become of him. Gregor dived beneath the fall. It was very difficult swimming because of the currents, and he had to dive to the bottom to get behind the pouring wall of water. There was a rock where he came up, and a great cave behind the fall, in front of which the water streamed down. He went into the cave, where there was a large fire burning, and a horrible great giant, most fearful to behold, sitting before it. As Gregor entered, the giant sprang up, seized a halberd and struck at him, for he could both strike and thrust with it. It had a wooden shaft and was of the kind called heptasax. Gregor struck back with his sword and cut through the shaft. Then the giant tried to reach up backwards to a sword which was hanging in the cave, and at that moment Gregor struck at him and cut open his lower breast and stomach so that all his entrails fell out into the river and floated down the stream. The priest, who was sitting by the rope, saw the water all thickened and bloody and lost his head, believing that Gregor was killed. He left the rope and ran off home, where he arrived in the evening and told them for certain Gregor was dead, and said it was a great misfortune to have lost such a man. Gregor struck a few more blows at the giant before he was dead. He then entered the cave, kindled a light and explored. It is not told how much treasure he found there, but there is said to have been some. He stayed there till late into the night, and found the bones of 2 men which he carried away in a skin. Then he came out of the cave, swam to the rope and shook it, thinking the priest was there. Finding him gone, he had to climb up the rope hand over hand, and so reach the top. He returned to Idardalsa and carried the skin with the bones in it into the vestibule of the church, together with a rune staff, upon which were most beautifully carved the following lines. Into the fall of the torrent I went. Dank its maw towards me gaped. The floods, before the ogre's den, mighty against my shoulder played. And then, hideous the friend of Mela came. Hard were the blows I dealt upon her. The shaft of Heptasax was severed. My sword has pierced the monster's breast. There too, it was told how Grettir had brought the bones from the cave. When the priest came to the church on the next morning, he found the staff and all that was with it and read the runes. Grettir had returned to Sandhagar. When Stein met Grettir again, he asked him exactly what had happened, and Grettir told him. He declared the priest had held the rope very faithlessly, and Stein admitted that it was true. Men felt no doubt that these monsters were responsible for the disappearance of Thorstein and his servant, nor was there any haunting or ghost walking there afterwards. Grettir had evidently cleared the land of them. The bones were buried by the priest in the churchyard. Grettir stayed that winter in Bardadal, though unknown to those who sought his blood.